Welcome to the podcast of ReMO, the Researcher Mental Health Observatory. In the previous season of this podcast, we have heard the stories of 3 brave researchers who came forward to share their struggles on their journey through academia. In this season, we meet 3 guests who bring a different perspective. They talk about the reality of academia today, both at personal and systemic level, commenting on what works and what doesn't, and most importantly, on how to move forward. In other words, they contribute to a transformation of the research ecosystem to benefit well-being and mental health of the professionals, the people who work in it. Quote, "We refuse to see things for what they are and ask why. We want to envision things that never were and ask, why not?" I am Federica Bressan and I welcome you on this podcast. Welcome everybody and welcome to our guest, Wainer Lusoli, Deputy Head of Unit of the European Research Executive Agency. Welcome, Wainer. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be on the podcast today.
Thanks, Federica, for the invitation.
It will be our pleasure to listen to you. So part of what impacts young researchers in a negative way is systemic. That is, with all of our personal differences, our backgrounds, family situations, etc., we're all fish in the same tank. That is to say, we work in the same environment, which is, broadly speaking, Europe. Even with all the local differences from country to country, we can say that there is such thing as a European research ecosystem because many policies are written at European level, and much of the funding is managed at European level. An underlying fact that precedes these statements is that science is, of course, institutionalized. It's publicly funded. It's managed, monitored, evaluated by public institutions. To think that science is this romantic, anarchic enterprise would be wishful thinking today, because how science is done, the rules of the game, are dictated by various institutions that need to consider several extra science factors in the way they operate. Science is embedded in an administrative system. And this system has been changing. It is changing. And this is what we want to talk about today, because part of what has a negative impact on people working in science is to be laid at the feet of the system. In the first part of this conversation, I would like you to talk a little bit about how the research ethos has changed. What you see at high level or at macro level that may be throwing sand in the gears of young researchers.
Well, thanks for framing the issue in systemic fashion. I think that clearly the people who are suffering the consequences of changing science are the researchers on the field, young researchers especially. And clearly, equally clearly, the institutions, research institutions and universities and research centers are the ones that do enable and do transmit the systemic change to the individual. So clearly it's a picture where the micro and then the institutional and the systemic come together. But a good lens of analysis is indeed a systemic. There's been a lot of speculation in the academia of the last, I don't exaggerate probably, but saying 20 years, about how is science changing. And some of the trends of change have been discussed and reported in the literature. I'm not a greater expert here on the systemic changes in mesoscience, but some are very evident to the researcher in the field as well as people in policy-making positions. Clearly, the science has been speeding up, so the time to discovery has decreased over time. But at the same time, we witness these trends of decreasing return on investments. So there's a lot of investment in science that is not 100% sure that is comparable to the investment productivity that was, let's say, the same 20 years ago. In other words, we spend more and we find less, comparatively speaking. Because in absolute terms, science is very productive and is faster than it used to be. There's no doubt about that. But these two things, the speed and the decrease in return on the public investment, are a troubling issue for the policymaker. And they have consequences which we will discuss perhaps later for the scientists on the field. The second issue, I would say, or the second, if you believe the Gardner way of looking at things, the megatrend would be the increasing mechanization of science. So the scientist used to be the one that in this infamous ivory tower had the time and the leisure and the luxury and the social status that allowed her or him most of the time, to be thinking, to be taking time off with very few tools that the scientist himself herself created, or with a small community of peers that met occasionally, let's say, at conferences, events, leisurely, almost, to today's mechanized science in which tools are more important than brains. And I say this willingly, it's not an overstatement. If you don't have access to large-scale research infrastructures, if you don't have access to large research groups and large funding, it's very unlikely you'll come up with a breakthrough. Unless you're a mad mathematician or someone is portrayed in film and movies. But this is for film and movies. The reality is that if you're not part of a big group, if you're not well funded, if you don't have access to machines, and increasingly sophisticated machines that someone else builds, not yourself, not your technician, someone you don't even know far away in Japan or somewhere else, then it's unlikely you'll produce good, inverted commas, science. And that's a troubling issue for someone like me who thinks, and many others who think that the individual is at the center of this research ecosystem. And then clearly there are other issues in relation to this mechanization, social issues. So larger research groups makes it more complicated for people to stand out. Well, you go into your PhD with this fantasy that you need to be producing something original alongside another million PhDs out there, and with large groups collaboration, signaling your contribution to the Higgs boson discovery, if you're lucky enough to be at CERN at the time, is very, very complicated. It's not about publish or perish, it's about counting numbers. So that's not easy as well. So large groups lower the incentives, as far as I understand it, let's say. And then there's other things that are more common in the press, as this publish and perish I just mentioned, this idea that unless you produce 15 papers a year in high-impact journals, then you're nobody, and your impact factor goes very low. But that is not the problem. The problem is there are 1,000 other PhDs in your situation. There's 1 million of them. There's so many PhDs nowadays. So not being elitist here and saying there should be less PhDs, because this is anathema. You can't say that. Everybody who wants to be a scientist should be a scientist. But at the same time, in the good old age that never existed, it was a bit of a privilege and required a bit of guts to become a bit of a scientist. Nowadays, the choice is easier. Oh, I'll do a PhD. But then again, after 3 years, what do I do with this PhD? And you become a number in a bigger machine that you had imagined maybe. This may generate some frustration. So science as well, as I say, reinforced by publish or perish and an avalanche of publications, most of which are good. I'm not saying that the value is going down. It's more difficult to find original results, but to sift them in the millions of articles that appear every single minute, it is very complicated, very, very complicated. Then I would say another couple of things, another couple of trends that come out of research we at the European Commission did a couple of years ago, as we were looking at reproducibility of science. So I should probably say I reflected on this issue coming from this angle. Can we reproduce science? And some of the experts we were consulting for writing about reproducibility talked about the double shift. As in, scientists had one job, and today scientists have 2, 3 jobs. They need to be scientists, they need to be talking to the public, they need to be publishers, they need to peer review other people's manuscripts, even before they go into the publishing line, in the pipeline, as it's called. So they work a double shift. Who pays them for a double shift? Nobody. And what incentives do they have to do the double shift? It's like the publish or perish. So either you do the double shift or you don't go very far. But this is a bit an exaggeration. It's a big exaggeration, but it gives you an impression of the trend, I guess. And then perhaps, and finally, and this is something I've been thinking about a bit with colleagues recently, kind of this shift in responsibility onto the shoulders of the scientist. So more and more was done by technicians, as I said. More was done by professional science communicators outside, specialized press, the academies. And more of this responsibility now, for good reasons, is shifted onto the shoulders of scientists. And this is good, it's empowering. truly say you have a duty to go to society and say and shout, this is my research. This matters for you. This matters for your everyday life, for your life chances. I found a cure for this or the other. You see, I contributed to the COVID vaccine development. Look at me. Look at us. But at the same time, if you don't do that, you don't have your 15 minutes of fame. And where does it leave you? Not in a good spot unless you're able to find the right channels. So this shift of responsibility may be bearable for all the researchers that have published tons and are established in the field. But for younger researchers who need to come to the fore, publish or perish, part of a group, having access to the machines, speed research, on top you're responsible and accountable for whatever you do. It's a lot. It's a lot. It would take a toll on everybody. The older scientists complain, the younger scientists, I guess, they suffer a bit more in silence. And clearly there's things to say about public funders and the research institutions, but we can talk about them maybe in the framework of how do we tackle this.
Thank you for outlining some of the mega trends of science today, or actually of the science ethos, the parameters within which science operates. You mentioned speed and mechanization, for example, with the consequences on the day-to-day activities of young and senior researchers. But who talks about these things? Who reflects upon them? They seem very relevant to me, but not really often talked about or brought into the conversation on mental health and well-being in academia.
Well, quite a few people, I would say. So let's say that 1 in 3 articles in Nature and Science, the editorials, talk about science as an evolving subject. So if you want to talk meta-science, which is what we're talking about, or philosophy of science, or epistemology of science, or ethics in relation to science, there's a huge debate raging. Well, just everybody who's anybody at some point in their careers will reflect on these issues, as is normal. From a policy point of view, or policymakers' point of view, responsibility in research, reproducibility in research, transparency in research, ethics, ethos you were talking about. I try to shy away from the ethics debate because then again you go into issues of what should be done and what not should be done. But let's also bring in the ethical perspective. The bread and butter, it should be of everybody, but of a very specialized community of social technology studies, for instance. There are many scholars working on these issues. So, and clearly I'm not one of them now. I just try to touch the surface. But probably the point I'm trying to make is that it goes back to what I said. It's becoming a bit everybody's responsibility to be reflecting on these issues, which makes it circular and more difficult to debunk because you need to reflect on yourself, which is never quite easy, and on your research practice, which is never easy. And take the proper distance to be able to reflect requires a maturity that certainly I didn't have as a scientist. I don't know about you, Federica, as a scientist. If you reflected back on what you were doing the following days, very complicated for me. So I think ethics is about proper distance and being able to take a separation. And this takes years, takes space and takes time. It's just not improvised. So much of the debate that goes on about how is science changing and where it should go and the ethics of it that you were asking about is sped up as well. It goes at a speed that doesn't allow for reflection. Take examples, take shale gas extraction. 3 years ago, it was ultimate evil in the scientific community. You can't do that for an environment. Now you find out that the gas crisis is caused or exacerbated by the fact that the United States reduced the fracking because of ethical concerns. But right now, just the consumers in Europe pay a very high price for gas, and there will be life consequences for a lot of Europeans. 3 years ago, the debate was clear in ethical terms. You don't do fracking. There's a report of high-level group of the European Commission say it's bad for you, it's bad for the environment, it's bad for the communities. It creates polluted waters, it creates dynamics in communities of confrontation, it creates bad health. Now you think again, 3 years later, the same ethical issue, you say the lack of fracking causes suffering in the most disadvantaged group in society. So consider yourself, you're a scientist, and you're doing research on fracking. Practically, how do we do it? How do we inject water in the coal mines, in the wells, in a way which is effective and efficient. 3 years ago, you had to reflect on this issue and you came to some conclusion. You reflect now again on the same issue and you come to different conclusions. And this in the span of 3 years. The nuclear debate ranged over 20 years. Now this one takes 3 years. COVID, vaccines, are they safe? Oh, we always knew there were issues with vaccines, clearly. But in 3 years, literally 3 years, we had to revisit the science we had, you see. And scientists themselves are asked to reflect on the consequences of changes in technologies and in implementation, direct implementation in society. So not just the science in the lab, but the implication for society. And this is the scientist that is asked to reflect upon in a very short time, being involved on the front line of the research. And this is unprecedented. So it creates an ethical strain for everybody, I guess, because you're asked to do many things at the same time. I don't want to overdo this because it's a bit of a reflection more than anything else, but I think we need to go back to proper distance and separation of roles between the controllers and the controlled. You can't ask scientists to do everything. They never finish, they never win.
Thank you again for keeping the conversation at the level of the meta-science, where we find many factors that have ramifications all the way down to the day-to-day activities of the researchers, impacting the rules of the game, so to speak. And you've mentioned speed, the mechanization of science, and then ethics, providing clear examples of how it can impact not just how research is done, but what research is done, indeed multiplying the skills and the roles of the individual researchers. Now, I'm not going to ask you why there has been a growing interest in mental health and well-being in academia today. The big question, why now? I would rather like you to give us a quick historical perspective on how the meta-science discourse has been changing over the past decades, and when did we start to observe the early signs that are found to be the main culprits of a deteriorating well-being of researchers today?
That's a terrible question you're asking me, partly because the discussion on inverted commas again, modern science, has been raging vigorously in the academia recently. And they're asking exactly the same question you are asking. So why now? And how is science different, so different today that we're really talking about a paradigm shift in the way it is conducted, which has clearly health implications, it has ethical implications, and it has life chances implications for the people who decide, despite all the contrary advice, to embark on PhDs and academic careers. So it is complicated. This has to do, I think, with longer-term trends. You talk about when did it start? Maybe 100 years ago, increasing professionalization of science. So it becomes a profession. Not that before it was not a profession, but with introduction of PhDs in the United States at the beginning of the century and the spreading of the PhD as a mechanism to transform intellectual potential in the community into science, which is what a PhD is, building clearly on primary education, secondary education of a certain quality. Then again, a professionalization via the PhD has spread in the Anglo-Saxon world and then in the non-Anglo-Saxon world. Being Italian, I know very well that the PhD was instituted in Italy in the 1980s. It's a baby. And this professionalization has spread in different countries almost seamlessly. Now China, Japan, not now, I'm saying now, but it's 2 decades. And then Japan before then, and Korea and Singapore. Just long story made short, it's professionalization of science that brings us where we are, necessarily, because clearly society becomes more complex, problems become wicked, technologies are in need of a fast evolution, and you need some people, more people than you needed before, with more technical skills and more accountability for what they do to be producing this science. And it has to do clearly with the increasing pace of innovation over the last 100 years. So if you review the main innovations that have come to the fore, let's say at the beginning of last century to the beginning of this century, is breathtaking, literally breathtaking. So physics was born, modern physics was born 100 years ago. And then the radio was born 100 years ago, a bit more than that. And then just review just communication technologies, the pace of it, but not just that, medical science, clearly, metallurgy. So this expansion didn't follow the dynamics of systemic change we were talking about before. The other thing I think that I didn't make reference to, we tend to think of science as a public system. And this is the assumption. We never question that. Science is for the public, by the public, and the young scientists come from society and they give back to society. But all the money, most of the money they spend on research nowadays is spent in the industry to make profit, to make weapons. I don't like to say that, but it's what it is. To make vaccines that are sold at a big price. No, they're not cheap. Vaccines are not cheap. We don't see the prices, but they're not cheap, I can tell you. So, that monetization of science has been going on for a long, long time. Not that it didn't happen before, but nowadays, just look at the big, I will not say big pharma, but big pharmaceutical companies, the profits they make, just on the open market in times of crisis. So part of the research and development, big part of research and development underpinning the trends we were talking about, originate in the industry and are not beyond the control of the policymaker, clearly not, but they have their own dynamics. They have their own ethical rules. Then I'm not saying that researchers in the private sector don't follow ethical rules, quite the contrary, especially in health. They lead the pack on transparency, reproducibility, ethics, what can be done, what cannot be done. So very, very often they contribute to public science more than they take, which is very good, apart from basic research. Basic research is public money, most of it. But anyway, if we exclude basic research, basic science, just for a second only, then I think that this responsibility, and there's a trend of monetization of science alongside professionalization that we don't often question. The policymakers doesn't have many levers to touch it. It can be done gently, it can be done less gently, but the policymaker at the end of the day does need the revenue that comes from technological investment. And it's been very, very clear over this century, let's say a century, but even before, that money that you spend in research and development brings a lot of benefits to the generating society. So I'll go back to steps and go back to your question now. If we look in the past, where the drivers, I would stick to professionalization and I would stick to industrialization of science. Just going beyond academia, well into a production fabric of society. Getting increasingly complex nowadays is very, very hard to keep track.
Thank you, Wainer, for pointing out what the mega trends of academia are, where they are today, and how they impact the day-to-day life of researchers at work. In the second part of this conversation, I will ask you about the positive aspects of the mega trends that may be desirable to consider when planning for a systemic change that benefits the mental health and the well-being of researchers. So see you again in the second part of this episode of the ReMO podcast with Wainer Lusoli. Thank you for listening to this podcast. For more episodes, please check out our website at remo-network.eu. ReMO is spelled REMO-network.eu. The podcast was brought to you by the Researcher Mental Health Observatory, Cost Action number 19117. I am Federica Bressan, host and producer of this podcast. Additional audio editing by Davide Linzi.